Hi, my name is Girish Daswani. Welcome to the Everyday Orientalism podcast series. We're here to celebrate the 10th anniversary of Everyday Orientalism, a public platform through which students, academics, and citizens reflect on how history and power shape the ways in which human societies define themselves. The platform foregrounds the histories and political struggles that those in power often seek to erase. Defined by Palestinian-American literary scholar Edward Said, Orientalism is a Western style for dominating, restructuring, and having authority over the Orient. Featuring a stellar lineup of guests, we explore how Orientalism continues to have deep ramifications in our everyday lives, for how we think about settler colonialism, liberation, and how empire and capitalism continue to exploit and dehumanize the majority of us. As Israel has bombed and ravaged not just Palestine, but Lebanon, Iran, and much of West Asia, it has become even clearer how much of genocide is simultaneously ecocide, the severe, long-term, and widespread destruction of the environment. As of October 2025, over 80% of Gaza's water wells and croplands had been destroyed, and wastewater dumped directly into the land and the sea. Airstrikes against 4 of Tehran's oil depots and refineries in March 2026 caused acid rain stained black with oil that showered over the city and its people. In Lebanon, white phosphorus was sprayed over towns in the south, sickening people and animals alike, as Israel destroyed agricultural land and natural resources, impacting water, soil, air, and trees. This ecocide is perpetrated through the destruction of animal and plant habitats, drinking wells, reservoirs, pipe networks and pumping stations that connect people to their lands and means of survival. Whole ecosystems, including agricultural land and green spaces, have been destroyed, leading to increasing food and water insecurity, chronic illnesses, and disease outbreaks. The end result is the transformation of this region into a dystopian and largely barren, uninhabitable land. A study by Queen Mary University of London found that Israel's attacks have generated 33 million tons of carbon dioxide as of March 2026. The lead author of the study, Dr. Benjamin Neymark, remarks that, quote, "Armed conflicts cause immense humanitarian and economic harm, but their environmental consequences are rarely quantified. Our research shows that war can generate substantial greenhouse gas emissions, from active military operations through to the rebuilding that follows." Close quotes. The total carbon footprint of Israel's wars and its contribution to the global climate crisis is yet to be calculated, but it will have long-lasting negative consequences on us all. It is also not lost on me that the environments that suffer the most belong to regions that have been orientalized and othered since the 19th century. Colonial capitalism and Orientalism continue to cast a long shadow over the present, and in ways that adversely impact regions and countries in the non-Western world. Somehow, the people and the places that belong to these imagined geographies are not only articulated and invaded by imperial and colonial ambitions, but also seen to be worth less in the Western collective consciousness. As Edward Said wrote in his book Orientalism, this imaginative geography has helped, to quote him, the mind to intensify its own sense of itself by dramatizing the distance and difference between what is close to it and what is far away. Close quotes. In other words, this mental operation allows the current ecocide to be seen as happening elsewhere, to others, in the East. And through this rationalization, it does not involve us in the West. This learned distanciation and displacement is part of what allows the ecocide to be carried out, unfettered and unabated. Another side of that same coin is the mindset that allows colonial powers to view, and again to quote Said, the Orient as a geographical entity over whose destiny they believe themselves to have traditional entitlement. Close quotes. This colonial ideology persists in today's world and in modern nation states through the assumption that some are more suited to exploit and control natural wealth for their own profit. But at what cost? With us here today are two scholars who have been considering the environmental costs of Orientalism and colonial capitalism, and who challenge us to reorient ourselves away from the often false distinction between people and nature as we think about the ways in which we co-constitute each other. Joanne Leow grew up in Singapore and lives as an uninvited guest on the unceded traditional territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. She is Associate Professor and Canada Research Chair of Transnational and Decolonial Digital Humanities at Simon Fraser University. Her most recent publication is the hybrid memoir, Exhumations, in the Body of a Petrostate from Alchemy Press 2026. She's currently working on a SSHRC-funded project intertitled Polyphonies, archiving the contemporary shorelines of Hong Kong, Singapore, and Vancouver in collaboration with artists, activists, and writers from each city. Yasmine Hafez has recently completed her PhD at SOAS, University of London, and is a fellow of the Water Diplomacy Centre at Jordan University of Science and Technology. Drawing on ethnographic fieldwork across the Nile Basin and extensive archival research, her work examines power dynamics in water management and traces the long-term political, social, and ecological processes shaping water governance and environmental justice. She has worked closely with civil society actors and contributed to several publications on water politics and ecological struggles. Welcome, both of you, Joanne and Yasmine, to our podcast. Thank you for being here, and I'm very happy to have the both of you.
Thank you for having us.
Just want to say congratulations to you both, because you're both joining us after having achieved some success in your lives. I want to say congrats to Yasmine for completing the PhD that she's been working on for a long time. And
thank you so much.
And to Joanne for the publication of your most recent book, Exhumations, which we will speak about as well. It's an amazing read, and I can't wait for more people to also have a read of it. Welcome to you both. So both of your work reminds us that whether it is water, oil, land, and soil, sand, resources are always connected to national projects and to aspirational fictions or fantasies of the future. To begin, can you take turns to introduce us to your respective work and how it is related to the environments of the regions and the projects that you write about and the countries that you focus on, Singapore and Egypt? Joanne, you want to go first?
So I was born and raised in Singapore, as you mentioned. So a lot of my work in the past decade or so has been focused on that site. Since I grew up there and was sort of conditioned and disciplined to understand that our country was exceptional in Southeast Asia, and, we were aspiring to be the Switzerland of the region, a lot of that, I suppose, I want to say propaganda was imbibed. I imbibed it from my youth. And then moving away to do my undergraduate in the United States and my doctoral work in Canada, I sort of looked back at what was happening and reappraised, I think, what was happening around me as I was growing up and then working in Singapore as a journalist. And I realized that a lot of what I understood of the country were, in fact, misapprehensions. And a lot of things that I took for granted, the success, the prosperity, as you say, the aspirational dream of Singapore as this utopia, clean, green, lush, tropical, I wouldn't say sterile, but this kind of model nation. I think The Economist called us the post-colonial exception. All those things were underpinned by a lot of exploitation, both of labor and of resources. And so I do think that a lot of my work in the recent years has been considering that and really unpacking what it meant to be privileged as someone from the ethnic majority living in Singapore, as a woman living there who was afforded opportunities that were not afforded to other women coming from, Southeast Asia, meeting scholars here in Canada and North America who were refugees from the same region in Southeast Asia, and then understanding how a lot of Singapore's success were based on the externalities, the outsourcing of contamination, pollution, extraction, exploitation to the region. And so where we were conditioned to understand that we were exceptional, what we were was actually incredibly embedded in the region in very damaging ways. So I write about sand coming from Cambodia, Vietnam, and Malaysia. Singapore is an oil refining hub, one of the largest in the world, taking in oil and then channeling it elsewhere. And then, of course, the exploitation of migrant labor, which I think is, again, another sort of form of psychological and ecological damage through using this labor to terraform parts of Singapore. And as I went on and on into my research, there was just so much to unpack, not just oil and sand and labor, but also things like, botany and gardening and horticulture as forms of control and pleasure. So I think that the bulk of my work has been, I wouldn't say sort of uncovering the narrative, but coming to a reckoning of what I was, literally working and living and studying around, and then coming to understand what those implications might be for the region around us, even in a more global way, how we were connected to various networks of power and violence that I don't think I was really, I don't think many of us were attentive to. And I'm not the only one doing this work. Plenty of scholars have come up at the same time or even before, and their work is crucial and vital, I think, to my understanding. And I think I hope, a larger conversation that can be had, not just about Singapore, but Singapore as a model, not in just the ways we hope it will be, but a kind of a real microcosm of the ways in which capital and settler colonial capital functions in the world.
Thank you very much. It's very interesting. I mean, I also come from Singapore, and I have traveled and been to Egypt. And so the comparison of these two countries also is particularly important, I think, because of not just because you're both from these parts of the world, but also because they share a similar post-colonial moment in which and where dreams and the futures or futurities were kind of crafted from that moment. Yasmine, can you speak to that as well as the relationship to the environment, but also to Egypt, to your work, and how you see all these connections?
I was thinking the same thing when Joanne was speaking, because a lot of what she said was really echoing with the experience of water in Egypt as well. Like, I grew up, and also the idea that you try to question the ideas that became embedded in your upbringing and in the society. And as a researcher, you try to understand where they come from and how they create a certain discourse and a narrative that also impact the future to come. So yeah, I grew up in Egypt. So for me, it was the Nile is Egypt, Egypt is the Nile. And the way we take it in school, it's always that it's passes by the other countries. It's never that it's shared by the other countries. And then in the master's, I started to take a class on water security by Mark Zaitoun, and we started to learn about hydrohegemony and counter-hegemony. And it was the same time when Ethiopia was also building the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam. And I was very keen into understanding why the dam, like why, as a very simple and basic question, like why the dam attracts such reaction and why does it kind of unify people. And I went to Ethiopia and I did my fieldwork. And then I started to analyze the role of grievances. So the kind of actual or perceived injustices and how the dam kind of answer the political and the economic grievances and how it becomes embedded in the society in such a way. But then I felt that I was also becoming part of the two kind of question equation, that it's either Egypt has the right to use the water or Ethiopia to use the water. And then kind of like the football match that is created around this issue, rather than to think on the nation state and how the water is used in the discourse to kind of unify the people around them. And the dam is like a central point of the idea that is human against nature, the kind of victory for the modernization and industrialization that happened in the 60s, but then somehow continue to take place until now. And so in my PhD, I started to ask about the lakes and the communities living around the lakes as a way to kind of center vulnerable waterscape and vulnerable water people. So the question kind of shift between like the states and like the quantity of water that is shared to who gets the water when within the states, who pays the price if the state does not get the water. And it was very interesting to kind of trace colonial archives to the operationalization of the lakes in the Nile, to neoliberal intervention in the lakes, until like climate business as well in the lakes, and how they all affect the priority of the lakes at every stage. And so, yeah, it's very interesting to think about the relation. It always fascinates me and never stops, like the relation between water and nation states and the projects, and how, like, growing up, I never understood why the High Aswan Dam brought that. Like, I do understand, but I never listened to the songs and everything. Like, I never understood this moment. And then living it with Ethiopia as well, and like seeing the songs that are playing and like the major kind of social turmoil the historical moment that is done by a dam is very interesting to see. So I think water and nation state and nationalism just go hand in hand, and it keeps on escalating in a way that is really scary and fascinating.
And what I really find very fascinating about both your work, but also what you just spoke about, is how you locate both Singapore and Egypt within the larger region. You don't simply isolate these nation states, but you show how they are intrinsically connected to its neighbors, whether it's within the Southeast Asian region or whether it's linked to Sudan, Ethiopia, for Egypt. And to follow up with my last question and what you spoke about as very nationalist or nationalizing projects for both these countries, I've seen contemporary writers, novelists sometimes describe these countries through abstractions, right, of their own imaginations, sometimes repeating nationalist propaganda, sometimes just regurgitating the things that they've read or they have been told. I've seen and read enough people writing about Egypt and Singapore from outsider perspectives with a gaze that is somewhat reproducing or a reproduction of this kind of Orientalist gaze. But you're both from these places that you write about. How does your subjectivity, your positionality, being from these countries, writing from the places that you write about, how does that actually influence the work that you do?
I think one of the things that I've been grappling about now, having published a book in Canada, and the previous book published by Liverpool University Press, was that I am in the diaspora now. But then you're right, like growing up there, working there for 7 years or so as part of state-run media gave me a completely different perspective as well. I mean, I think the tension is being an insider versus an outsider. For me, I very much do not want to be in the role of a quote-unquote native informant. I think that's very dangerous. And I feel like a lot of the times there are certain circles in academia and in the public where you are instrumentalized that way. Tell me more about Singapore from your perspective, because you know. And I think what I'm trying to emphasize in the work is there was so much I didn't know. And the labor of trying to understand that for me is really important. Yes, there are some things that I experienced in very emotional and psychological and bodily ways, being there and growing up and working there. But at the same time, I don't think that comes with some kind of, I can't assume that comes with a privileged knowledge. I mean, I have so many good friends and colleagues and peers in Singapore who are living there right now, who are also doing the difficult work of uncovering more to understand better, what the state is doing. And I think the other point I wanted to make is that how we're all complicit in it. So if I grew up there and benefited from the education system, benefited from construction of various infrastructural projects, as Yasmine was talking about, then I think part of it was finding out how deeply complicit we all are. And even living in Canada, if I receive research funding, which I do from the Canadian state, I'm also complicit in a petro state, because where do my wages and my research funds come from? They come from extraction, in no small part. So I think that is how I think about my positionality, both as someone who is trying to understand and to critique deeply, but then also with the knowledge that one can't ever not be complicit in this. We're already embedded in these systems. And I'm hoping that my work also forces people to confront this. Just because I'm doing research and I'm from that area does not mean I'm somehow innocent or superior to what's happening there.
No, thank you for that. That's a great response. Yasmine, what do you think?
Yeah, so when I started working on denial, because it's very it's a very contemporary issue and very heated nationalistically. So I feel whenever I write about Ethiopia or whenever I write about denial, it's always assumed my role because of like how secretized the issue is and how heated it is. And as someone that is local living in the country, it's also like kind of how to write and also kind of balance issues of safety and like there is a lot of tango play of like ensuring safety while also ensuring objectivity. So it's really kind of stressful and ongoing work, as Joanne was saying. Like it's not that you kind of face your subjectivity and then it moves on from there. It's like keeps on repeating itself within the research of like questioning your own position and questioning how you were benefiting from that, or questioning how you are also conditioned to think of certain things because of your upbringing and because of the society and so on. So when I started working on my PhD, it was very interesting and I love the issue of positionality. And with colleagues, we co-wrote an article that says like why you're not doing fieldwork at home. Because when I started doing fieldwork in Uganda and my colleagues worked in Uganda and Kenya, there was kind of the condition of, because you're Egyptian, you have to work on Egypt. Although like for foreign experts, it's kind of given that they would work. So we started to work on these questions, and then the project blew up, and then it started to become like a book project. And we just submitted the manuscript like a few weeks ago, and it has 25 chapters of people coming from different places and then doing fieldwork in other places where it's kind of not expected from them, or they faced issues that are not prepared for. So yeah, I think it's like an ongoing process. And as Joanne said, it's like also when you're doing fieldwork in your own country, you face issues that kind of not expected and that you're not prepared for it, because again, like the training does not prepare you for that. But when I was doing fieldwork as well in the PhD, I was doing around the lakes, where places I haven't grew up in and so on. And I also was faced with my own privilege of like how the society and communities perceive me, because I study abroad, because of like my accents, although like I grew up like born and raised in Egypt, but like also this questioned a lot of like how insider I am and so on. And I feel like ways of trying to think about positionality is being like reflective of that, like continuously being in check through colleagues and comrades, and also kind of force myself to speak about the issues that I'm doing research in Arabic to Egyptian, because I feel sometimes I do research and then the way I speak about a certain topic, I became very conditioned through academia. But then when I speak it, it's really challenging me so much when I talk about it to Egyptian audience in Arabic, because I know that so many of the ideas or like thoughts that I'm saying, they already know. So I have to push myself much more. So yeah, sorry, I took so much time, but I love the positionality issue, and I think we need to speak about it way more.
Yeah, I agree. From my own experience of just coming back from Singapore, I was there and I was talking about the politics of Singapore with someone. And they said to me, but Girish, you haven't lived here for many, many years. You don't know Singapore like I do, right? Because they live there. And so even though I have the nationality, the passport, and I grew up there till the age of 24, my very ability to position myself as someone who speaks with authority can also be questioned. So I think it's good that we do ask these things about ourselves as researchers. My next question goes to the unseen nature. I mean, Joanne, you speak to in your title of the book itself, you have this term, the petrostate. And the petrostate is something that is not normally commonly associated with Singapore. And Yasmine, when you think about the Nile and Egypt, certain ideas of what that means, like the Nile is associated with the country in ways that come out of also a nationalist projection. Can each of you speak to the things that maybe the people who are listening, our listeners, may not know about these respective countries? What is the relationship between Singapore and oil? And Yasmine, what is the relationship between Egypt and water that maybe people may not really be familiar with?
Yeah, I think when I was doing research to write this book, Exhumations in the Body of a Petrostate, I kept thinking about the idea of petrofiction, which is a term coined by Amitav Ghosh, writing about the Middle East and novels in the Middle East. And his contention was like, why are there so few books about oil? Novels, he meant fiction. And is it because it's all hidden? And I think a lot of other theorists have thought about that as well. It's everywhere. Energy is everywhere. It's how we function. Even in the conversation we're having right now, it's all functioning through particular technologies that are powered by fossil fuels. And I think for the longest time, as I mentioned before, Singapore was perceived as this beautiful garden city in a garden, tropical excellence, etc. And nobody wanted to talk about oil, even though it funded a great deal of prosperity. So even from colonial times, the offshore island of Pulau Bukom was already used for kerosene storage by the British. And then when Singapore gained their independence, they realized they didn't have natural resources, and that's something that's been drilled into people. Our only source of resource is human resource. But what was happening is at that point is they decided to make themselves the largest oil refining hub in Southeast Asia and among the top 4 or 5 in the world. One of the things that I found out was, there were so many expatriates from various other extractive petrostates working in this oil industry in Singapore that they called it the Houston of the East. And nobody likes to talk about that because oil is seen as dirty, justifiably so. And so nobody wants to be associated with it. And I think it's very telling as well that all the refining happens in an offshore island called man-made industrial Jurong Island in Singapore that was amalgamated from all these smaller islands reclaimed that had indigenous inhabitants on them who were displaced in order to build this industrial facility. Underneath Jurong Island are enormous caverns for the storage of basically fossil fuels, oil, and gas, which makes, Singapore, it has these reserves that make it hopefully less immune to oil shocks like the one we're seeing now. So nobody wants to talk about this. And I think that not just that history of extraction and refining that Singapore is a key node in, but what was that oil used for? One of the things I found out was a lot of the oil went in to fuel the American imperialist military machine during the Vietnam War. Nobody wants to talk about that. And so in my book, I talk about the relationship between oil and blood. Girish, when you started out the podcast today, you talked about the ecocidal effects of war and the carbon footprint of war. Where does that carbon footprint come from? It comes from extraction and petroleum. If you refine petroleum and you're responsible for exporting it, where does that petroleum go when you're in Southeast Asia, which is a region, especially during the hot Cold War, was embedded with what had all these conflicts? And so we were a peaceful oasis where American soldiers would come in for rest and relaxation during the breaks between fighting, but we were also powering the war. And I think to me, that's something that a lot of people don't like to think about. It's disturbing to think about. And it means that oil is blood. And if you have oil in your hands, you have blood in your hands, essentially. So I think that makes me very unpopular. It's a very unpopular counter narrative of Singapore, but I think it's very clear that we need to understand this.
Absolutely. And I'm from Singapore, like I've said before, and I never made these connections in that way until I read your book, and I'm not young anymore. So you think about how many years have I lived flying to and from Singapore over all these ships that I see every single day from the HDB, the Housing Development Board apartment that I live in, and flying over them, hundreds of ships on our coastal shores, right, that we can see, and making the connection to oil and war was not something I'd ever done until I read your book. So this is another reason why these are important things to talk about. And until we recognize these connections, we will remain very much in the dark. Yasmine, what about in Egypt? There are also certain things that people associate with the Nile, but also with the desert. And what can you share with us that perhaps our listeners may not know about in terms of water projects or even urban development projects in the deserts?
So I start with the relations with the Nile, and as you said, it's very central to the beginning of civilization and beginning of the livelihood. So it is the source of life, and not in a metaphorical way, but it's 90+% of water comes from the Nile. So it depends on it entirely. And because of that, it's any threat against the water is also seen as not only an economic threat, but it's a national threat to the country. And so the colonial history matters a lot because the historical rights that were in the water were given during colonial time. And that created the contention of the rights of the other countries that share the Nile River. And so the beginning of Ethiopia building the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam created a lot of antagonism of the project, because until the historical agreements asserted a veto of Egypt against any project that happened in the upstream. And also to imagine the river, I think, is very important because you have Egypt is downstream, you have all the country in the upstream. And so usually in the water transboundary issues, usually the downstream is weakened, but because the positionality of Egypt in the production of cotton and also a lot of industries and for its geographic and strategic, it had more power through historical rights and everything. And I think this story makes sense. But I think what I argue in my research that it also, again, conceals so many nuances, I think, in the story, because through searching for the lakes and the vulnerabilities around them, we can also see how Lake Victoria, for example, was very essential to colonial power and through the introduction and industrialization of fishing. And so the point was to kind of dominate and to control waterscapes around the Nile. And this happened through ways of creating the connections between the states as a way to control and tame the water, and also created the priorities of water scheme to be economic. And also this kind of deranged a lot of the social and environmental issues that are from the local people. And so you had the post-colonial state as well continuing the same discourses and the same kind of practices with water. And I think it also conceals also the differences within the country. And so rather than to see that Egypt kind of had the historical and then Ethiopia, what they're doing is kind of getting the right back, we can also see how the national state at Ethiopia as well, using the dam to unite people around them and also ignore the atrocities that are happening around, and how water have been like kind of thought and how the Nile have been imagined as kind of a group of states that are fighting for the quantity of water. And this raises and conceals lots of other important questions. In my work, of course, I work with the kind of usage of the projects that kind of conceal the communities and the vulnerabilities of communities like fisher folk. And that was like the kind of central point in my work. I worked with fisher folk in Egypt, Uganda, and Kenya, and I tried to see how the infrastructure project and kind of the fish industrialization of fishing is affecting their everyday life. And I think fisher folk for me was really change how I think of the water, because they are the most vulnerable, I think, because they depend on the daily kind of substance. They don't have like a piece of land where they get they depend on everyday work. They depend on the environmental changes, climate change, and the economic issues affect their work and so on. So I worked with fisher folk in Egypt and Uganda and Kenya, and I was trying to see how the projects that are happening within the lakes are affecting them. And I was trying to kind of shift away from seeing the Nile as like the one stream of river, the one line that we kind of imagined because of colonial power, colonial imagination, that it is like one line that is distributed in the states, but also the other richness of waterscapes are very important in its making, and the people that are kind of not seen in that dynamics.
Thank you. I want to speak about the importance of containing or managing these fictions, these nationalist fictions around water protection or around the greenery that we have in Singapore. So whether it's the, let's say, oil refineries of Singapore's offshore islands, or how about the Nile River and how it could be used through the Aswan High Dam for controlling water supply and for the agricultural production. These narratives that the nation states produce are really important to also, like we just spoke about, basically hiding the things that we don't see or we can't see. So I guess just to ask you to respond to how local populations are impacted by these fictions, right? So in the case of gardening in the Singapore landscape, like the actual work of building this garden city, or in the case of Egypt, building in the desert, right? I mean, these are ways of creating these fantasies and these fictions that are important to these nation states. But at the same time, there are always people involved, right? Local populations that are either working or are displaced from the work that is being done. Now, can you speak to that process?
I think that it's not just local. There's a lot of dispossession, displacement of indigenous populations like the Orang Laut and people, in particular, people of the sea. But a lot of the labor that goes into maintaining Singapore's image is regional and Asian labor that's imported and exploited. Migrant workers, transient migrant workers, as they're called, are not given proper labor rights, minimum wage guarantees. And I think that is what underpins a lot of the narratives, whether it's manicuring, cultivating, trimming, pruning, all the stuff, planting things, a lot of imported botanical species. For me, a lot of Singapore is not just the local population, but actually, I mean, okay, you talk about the local kind of ecologies being displaced by these manicured landscapes. I was just reading recently about there's going to be a new forest public housing development, the first of its kind, but they're actually cutting down local forests in order to build this, very contained landscape.
It's weird that you mentioned that, because when I was in Singapore, my cousin's husband felt it was necessary for him to drive me there and to show me that neighborhood And I don't know what, it's weird that you bring it up because he's like, you must see this new neighborhood. It's like called the Tinga. I know what the Tinga is. I know the neighborhood, but I've never seen it the way it was. And so it was this kind of like, it's always been something seen as removed, right? This neighborhood that's removed from the transport system, from the other infrastructures that the Singapore already has in place, because it was closer to, let's say, in a very quote unquote way, nature. It was part of the more forested part of Singapore. But now they've completely gone into it and turned it into an urban infrastructure and pruned that aspect of a nature to make it look very nice.
Yeah, and it's a camouflage, really, right? And it's in particular aesthetics of it. I think there's a great article by the geographer, I believe, and writer Joshua Komarov, who refers to gardening in Singapore as a paramilitary operation. And that's what it is. You're constantly battling tropical greenery because there's so much fecundity in that landscape. Then in order to produce the effect that you're seeking, you've got to constantly be, quote unquote, at war with it. During the COVID pandemic, essentially when all the workers were quarantined in dormitories under I would say pretty bad conditions, and they weren't allowed to come out, all the grass came back. Native species came back because there was, they were not ordered to be pruning and trimming and keeping the grass at regulation inch level. So, but I mean, there's so little of Singapore that is primary forest. I think there's some estimates that say, essentially during the colonial period when so much was cut down for plantations, we're basically only left with, I think, something like less than 2% of primary forest in Singapore.
It certainly feels that way, yeah.
Right? And then what we have in terms of greenery is mostly secondary forests, so planted post-plantation era. Even then, they're cutting that down. So I think especially also of the contrast between the much lauded super trees and the massive trees that were in Bukit Brown before they cut them down for the highway.
Not just the trees, but then the displacement of populations. You're talking about a cemetery with thousands of people were buried, especially from the Chinese diaspora. I've been to Bukit Brown before it was destroyed and the graves exhumed and displaced. It was a beautiful cemetery. So not just the actual trees and the landscape, but also like people's bodies being removed for the building of this particular highway.
Because the dead don't need to go anywhere fast, only the living. That's the calculus.
Yasmine.
I was thinking when you mentioned the fantasies of and how they affect like nature and so on, I was thinking within my work, I was trying to trace what's the priority for the lakes were for the colonial power and then for the neoliberal state and then for the climate business. And I think so much of what Joanne and you were saying of like how the kind of centralizing the aesthetic and centralizing the modernization is also happening around the lakes as well. So you see like the project of development of the lakes and the renovations, and you see them as like aesthetically modernized without small scale fisher folk, without the messiness of like the human lives that are around the lakes. And you see them also like, without any of that. And it also says a lot about like how communities express the future, and their ideas was like how they live with a doomed future, like how they, as they say in around Lake Victoria, is like you fish as if there is no tomorrow. So it's the idea of a doomed future that they're feeling that is making them having to survive. I try to explain how the States is also using this discourse as like the crisis discourse and trying to find other funds to kind of relief from it. So that when it comes to the lakes and the community living around them, but also I was thinking when you're speaking, and also because of the introduction that you mentioned, the ecocide is also the fantasy in the context of water that is like Israel is the kind of champion of desalination project, and it's the idea of blooming the desert exactly. And greening the desert. And we have seen from the day one in like the genocide how water was used against the people and how water stopped and how it's so, I can't find the word, like how infuriating, how insane it is that until now we don't see enough criticism of in the green environmental spaces of enough criticism of Israel, and still the use of desalination and the technology of the water is being put in the front. And it's like, this is technical, is completely separated from a genocide that is causing, and that it's not because of the genocide a country is able to have this technology and have this abundance of water. So I think it really comes to the front to the ecocides, like the use of water. And for me, it was very interesting to see how throughout the years I read about water wars, and we're being again and again being warned that the next war will be on war. And still this became like around scarcity, but not around ecocide. And as if the wars are not related to that, as if the wars and how the water is being weaponized as we are speaking now is not part of the water wars that we're speaking about.
No, you bring up a hugely important point, right? I mean, going back to Palestine and especially Gaza and the genocide and how it was alongside the actual murder of hundreds and thousands of people, how alongside that was a very purposeful, intentional destruction of the environment, but also, like you said, the purposeful destruction of the olive trees, the purposeful destruction of water wells, the destruction of the land and the soil, the inability of people to not just have access to their land and to grow on their land, but actually to kill the land and kill the topsoil. And these acts of destruction have led to the outbreak of diseases, chronic illnesses, and the forced starvation that we see taking place. So the points you make about water are extremely, extremely important here. And I think that one needs to always bring back the point that when we think about the environment and environmental acts of violence towards the environment, the intention is not just to gain resources, but actually to sometimes, in this case, destroy resources to be able to destroy people and their ability to live, which is the other side of this. Not just a byproduct of global warming, but the intentional acts of actually destroying. We've spoken about how building tourist projects or the construction of gardens by the bay in Singapore, how it leads to the destruction of the mangrove swamps in, let's say, Cambodia. The need for sand to be brought in from neighboring countries to be able to create this utopian, fictional, capitalistic environment in Singapore, which is also a tourist destination, but it affects and it takes away life from somewhere else. And this taking away of life while creating or profiting from that, I think is a simultaneous action that takes place in these contexts in which we're speaking about. So the idea of tourism is a huge theme, whether it's the Nile or whether it's Gardens by the Bay and it's all these beautiful sites in these countries, or Marina Bay Sands in Singapore, the new Alamein in Egypt, beachfront entertainment, resorts, areas in both these countries. How do they square up with what's happening around the world, like basically global warming? How ecologically sound are these tourist projects, these capitalist projects in these respective countries in Singapore and Egypt?
I mean, obviously, no, they're not. But I think what's really interesting to me, and you spoke to it as well, the outsourcing of this damage. There's this really famous film called The Lost World by the Cambodian-American filmmaker Kalyani Mam, who brings a Cambodian fisherwoman to Gardens by the Bay to show her where her river's stand has gone. And so, you're talking about the destruction of life worlds that are necessary, or not necessary, that are the basis of these aesthetically beautiful and profitable experiences. I'm also thinking about the fact that you take someone else's land and you transport it and you terraform and reclaim land in Singapore, you're also kind of occupying that land. You're not invading a country, but you are removing their land and destroying your own ecosystem in order to build these, spectacular entertainment touristic venues. One of the things that I've been thinking about a lot as well, not just about that particular space, is the Formula One race in Singapore. And it's a moment where it's great, it's fun, they bring in all these musicians and artists and, there's the thrill of it. But to me, that was one of the greatest moments where I felt like I needed to shake everybody and go like, do you see what they're doing? And I was a journalist covering the very first Formula One when it came back to Singapore and they brought it back. And I was not aware of that. I just stood there in this really tall building listening to the whine of the cars going by. But after a time, a decade later, I'll be like, do you know what's happening? F1 is essentially this fantasy that will never run out of oil, that these cars can go as fast as possible. And like, it's so glamorous and we'll never run out of oil. But this isn't sustainable. But it's so seductive. I don't want to understate how seductive these vistas and these spectacles are. I think that's the problem, that it's fun. And nobody wants to understand what that fun, how you can be accountable, where is that fun coming from? I mean, I don't think that I am any less, again, complicit in this. I go back to Singapore, I visit these sites.
Yeah.
They're fun and they're purposely built so that I think as the anthropologist Anne-Laura Stoller says, you don't think of it as ruins and debris of like terrible environmental consequences, but what you're actually looking at is the ruins of other places when you're looking at this beautiful landscape and having fun. You think you're in this spectacular space where you're enjoying yourself, but you're really in a kind of ruined landscape. You just can't see it. And the point about that film by Kalyani Mam, when the fisherwoman Pala visits the site, is that she sees it. She says, "This is my land." She lets the sand run through her hands. Everybody else around her is taking selfies of themselves in the space, and she is grieving. And I wish that we could sit with that feeling more. But I also want to acknowledge that it's really tough when you're being distracted by how beautiful everything is. It is beautiful. I don't want to deny that. Is it sustainable? No.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
But yeah.
I want to read that part actually from your book. At the end of her companion essay to the film, Mum asks, what kind of world can be built from sterile and lifeless sand and land that has no roots, no history and no memory, except for the violent extraction from its homeland? And what kind of world is left behind when roots, history and memory have been torn from beneath our feet? It is already enough to be removed from one's land. It is another thing entirely to have one's land removed as well. And in your book, you write about Afala, who you're describing what you see in the documentary. She grasps a handful of sand and lets it run through her fingers, an unmistakable echo of Lim's videos of sand being poured into the sea. She believes that it is still her land and says she is grieving for it. I think of her presence in the film dwarfed by the piles of sand, seen as an unwelcome ghost in the gardens, knowing all the while the cost of this Eden.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it's the ghosts of the beautiful projects that we are participating in. We're also complicit in. Yasmine, I know this is not a part of your research and you can only speak to it in so much as you can, but what about similar tourist destinations and projects in Egypt that might also not be ecologically sound?
So my mother family is from Alexandria, and we used to spend summer in Alexandria, and then when kind of the North Coast expanded, so we spent like time in the North Coast, and we used to always pass by Lake Moryut, but it was never kind of, you never really think of like because it's kind of secluded in a way that you don't see it on the road, like the high-speed road. And then I did my fieldwork around Lake Moryut, and it was very interesting to see, like, at every kind of time I would visit the lake, it was changing. It was changing really much, much faster than I could as a researcher document it. And I started to spend more time with the Bedouins living in the area. And one time they showed me, like, kind of on the rooftop of their house, like the kind of landscape. And the Bedouin daughter, she was telling me, like, the high-speedy train will come and will take on all these houses, and my school is there. And you start to see, like, how this high-speedy road and how the bridge that is connected between Lake Moryut and the high-speedy road because of the Alamein, and how the position of Lake Moryut west of Alexandria and how it is on the road from Cairo to the Alamein is being affected and is being lost in that, and how, because you don't see it on the high-speed roads or you don't encounter the livelihood, it just becomes silenced, and the ghost of, like, as Joanne beautifully articulated as you read it, becomes so much lost in the center imagination. It doesn't become important anymore. They are at the margins because of, like, how beautiful, how entertaining, how fun, and how this kind of embeds in the idea of modernization and as, like, kind of the center of tourism and everything. So I think spending time at, like, Lake Moryut, which is at the way or the connection to the new projects that are built because of New Alamein puts their livelihood at the center.
Yeah, thank you. That was, again, I think we've come around full circle, almost like the fantasies in which we participate in obviously also are inhabited by the ghosts of the erosion of coastal lines, the theft of soil and sand to build these spaces, and people's lives who are greatly impacted, who we don't see. But what we do see sometimes are the tourists, the travelers, the people who obviously are profiting from and investing in these spaces. I want to end with a question that has nothing to do with your research. I'm going to ask each of you if there was a song that inspires you, that gives you meaning right now, a song that you listen to over and over again when you want to get to a place where you can feel whole again. What would that song be?
So I think I would really like Genealogy of Revolution, Hamid Sinno. I really like this song. It's like a reflection on 10 years post-revolution Arab Spring. It's a very special song because I think it's like it talks about like the moment, the revolutionary moment, but in such a grief way. I remember when it came out, I kept on listening to it a lot of time. And now every once in a while I listen to it. So,
Joanne, I've given you enough time to basically Google something that you might not.
I don't know. I'll have to come back to you in the exact song. But I love this local band in Singapore called B Quartet. They're helmed by this amazing musician, Bani Haikal. And they have an album called Conformity Has Replaced Consciousness. And that came out actually, it was released in 2010. And I will come back to you about the exact song, but one of the songs from that album. And then I also wanted to suggest
add more.
Not technically a song, but a soundtrack. Some of the work that I've been doing on the coastlines of Singapore has just involved field recording. And I think for me, it's really important. I don't know how you're going to include this in your soundtrack, but for me, it's very important to sit down and listen to non-human sounds. And that has been very inspiring, actually, for me, making these field recordings of the waves, of construction, actually, of the birds, the children playing along the shoreline, but mostly actually the non-human sounds that are literally the sounds of the space that has been altered by man, but also the persistence of the sound of the sea. And I think that if you want, I'll send you one of my recordings. But I love this idea that a field recording, in some ways, when you sit by the beach in Singapore, man-made as it is, you can still hear a kind of symphony.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I grew up by the beach, and it's the place that I go to for my meditative, reflective moments. And that sound of the waves, of everything else, even of the mammals that you sometimes hear, it definitely is something that gives me peace. Well, thank you for both your suggestions and recommendations. We will eventually be sharing with you the playlist, so look out for that. I want to thank the both of you for being such amazing guests on our podcast show. And, I want to say thank you for the work that you do, for the work that you continue and will do in the future, because it's important that we ask the questions that you ask in the work that you do, related not just to the human lives that we all care about, but the relationship between the human and the non-human and the environments in which we are all a part of. So thank you once again.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having us. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Really enjoyed that. Thank you a lot. And learned a lot from Joanne as well. Thank you. It was lovely to share this space with you as well.
Thank you, Yasmine.
This podcast series was created for the 10th anniversary of the platform Everyday Orientalism, and in conversation with its editors Catherine Bloy and Osama Ali Gad. To find more content and to subscribe, you can visit everydayorientalism.wordpress.com. This podcast was recorded at the University of Toronto. The land that the University of Toronto is on has always been Indigenous land. In 1827, the British King gave over 200,000 acres of Indigenous land appropriated by the Crown to the Anglican bishop to establish King's College. We wish to acknowledge that despite this history of settler colonialism, for thousands of years, this has always been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. Today, this meeting place is still home to many Indigenous peoples from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. I would like to thank our research assistant Sophie Plotkin and our editor and producer Taylor Stark for helping make this podcast possible. Thank you for listening.